Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are in the world. We are so delighted to have you here for our first keynote session tonight, How Family Policing Harms Parents and Why It Matters. And we have Assistant Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Sarah and Neil Meyerhoff Center for Families, Children, and the Courts at the University of Baltimore School of Law as our keynote speaker, Shanta Trivedi. And I'm going to turn it over to Shanta, but in just a second. But we are so honored to have her as our keynoter. She's a thinker and an advocate and just a passionate researcher who is contributing a knowledge base and perspectives into this conversation around family policing. And again, we're honored to have you, and I will turn it right over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction. As Lisa said, I'm Shanta Trivedi. I teach at the University of Baltimore School of Law. I'm also a mom to two young parents. And prior to joining academia, I represented parents in child welfare proceedings. And I went into this work not knowing anything about the system. I thought that every parent who was in the system did something heinous, like what we see on the news. Monster mom, trapped child in a dungeon for 5 years without food. And what I quickly learned is that this is a tiny fraction of families in the system. I learned that the majority are simply regular people doing their best to raise their children under the hardest of conditions. I learned that the system is not a place where we always prioritize children's welfare, and we never prioritize the well-being of their parents. That this system is punitive and harmful, and in many cases takes families that maybe were struggling with poverty or other related issues, and instead of improving their lives, exacerbates their hardships. I learned that the system is really about policing and regulation. And that is why I and a lot of other people call the child welfare system the family policing system. And before I get into the rest of my presentation, I just want to explain a bit of what I mean by this as grounding principles. The parents who are enmeshed in the United States family policing system are primarily poor, and they are primarily people of color. And rather than helping them, the system causes them and their children immense harm. The children that the system claims to protect often have worse outcomes than their peers. And in the United States, the numbers vary, but approximately 74% of the cases that are substantiated are for neglect. About 16% are for physical abuse, and about 10% are sexual abuse. And many of these so-called cases of neglect are actually about poverty. Many cases are more clearly about poverty, such as those dealing with unstable housing or failure to provide adequate food or clothing. Others may deal with substance use or mental health concerns. And some might say that these latter cases are not related to poverty. But first, poverty can exacerbate those conditions. And second, poor people are certainly not the only families to struggle with them, yet they're the only ones to lose their children. And that is because wealthier families can address their problems because they have better health insurance and better access to medical care in their communities. On the other hand, people who live in lower income communities face a dearth of those services. And even if they do exist, they can be hard to access or have long wait lists. Many people want to receive treatment and simply can't. Disentangling poverty from neglect can be very complicated. Take a case of a mother leaving a sleeping child unsupervised while they go to the store at night. Some might say she's irresponsible. Others might say if she had a higher living wage and better work hours, she'd be able to afford babysitting or go shopping during the day when her child is awake. If childcare were more affordable, she wouldn't have to resort to leaving her child alone. People who work in the system strongly disagree on whether the root cause of the situation like this is poverty or neglect. Further, when it comes to the U.S. family policing system, there has also been extensive research and overwhelming evidence naming both the racist foundation and current day racism in the implementation and impact of the family policing system. The American Bar Association, the United Nations, and the Biden administration, among others, have all acknowledged this publicly. Family policing harms virtually all marginalized parents and communities, including those already discussed, but their harm has broad reach. Black families, LGBTQ families, survivors of IPV, disabled parents, substance users, Latinx families, and many other communities have faced historical discrimination, including family separation in many cases. Today, Black and Native families continue to be disproportionately targeted by the family policing system. In particular, at minimum, about a third of Black families would be investigated by CPS, or as high as 62.8%. Black parents are more likely to be reported to CPS initially, to have the allegations against them substantiated, and to have their children removed. They're also less likely to have their children returned to them. Native parents have their children removed at 4 times the rate of their peers. And the worst part of this all is that the system does not improve children's well-being. In 2019, I published an article about the harm of removing children from their parents in the family policing system. That article discussed the ways that children suffer when they're removed from their parents and placed in the foster system. It details the lifelong trauma that children face after being ripped from their parents, siblings, and communities. Further, it shows how rather than improving their lives, the system made their lives worse. Children who were in the foster system in America are more likely than their peers to live in poverty, to be unhoused, to struggle with their mental health and substance use disorder, to become parents before they're ready, to have juvenile system involvement, and less likely to finish school or to be employed. Maybe in some of the countries that you are all from, it is different for foster youth, but this is what the reality is in the United States. But what I'd like to talk to you about today, though, is about how the system harms the parents of these children. I want us to explore why we don't talk about parents in a system that is supposed to be about children's well-being, why we ignore parents, or even worse, treat them like they don't matter. I want to talk to you about why, if we care about children, we must care about their parents. But separate and apart from their children, we should care about parents because they are our sisters and our brothers. They are our community. And before I get into my research, I just want to say thank you to the many parents who have shared their painful stories of injustice in spaces like these, so that those of us who are fortunate to only understand the system as advocates can begin to try to understand the harmful impacts that the family policing system has had on their lives and the lives of their children. Thank you for speaking out, for writing your stories or talking to journalists, and for the many ways that you are leading the charge to advocate for system change or abolition. My goal in doing this research was to situate the experiences of those parents in social science so the non-believers could understand that these are more than anecdotes. Both the experiences of families who have had family policing involvement and research demonstrate that the harm that the family policing system affects is real and often irreparable. And perhaps you're familiar with the research, but not the experiences of parents themselves. I urge you throughout this conference to listen to the professionals, sure, but please make time to listen to the parents and youth themselves. I want to first note that there's very little research on how the family policing system harms parents in the United States. And I think that is very telling. Most of the formal research is from the UK. The little research on parents that does exist in the US is done by people of color, which I think is also very telling. I am grateful to those social scientists for their work. I also want to warn people that the content of this presentation is very heavy and maybe upsetting for some of you. It is the reality for so many, though, and I think our conversation today is necessary. But please take care of yourself throughout this presentation and after. I also know that some of you may disagree with my characterization of things or my recommendations, and that's okay. I appreciate your time and your openness. So first, I will talk about the harmful effects of mandated reporting, family policing investigations, and court proceedings, and what happens to parents when the state removes their children and in some cases permanently terminates their parental rights. Then I will explore why I think we as a society fails to acknowledge the harms that the system inflicts on parents and why the focus is almost singularly on children. And finally, I'll talk about a few short-term changes we can make to reduce the harm of the system and what I think we must do in the long term if we actually want to keep children safe. People who are critical of the family policing system, including myself, have historically focused on the harms caused by removal. And certainly there are many, which I'll get to in a second. But the system inflicts harms at all stages of the process, even before a parent is reported. Parents report that they are scared to seek help when they need it because they are worried about investigations and the very real possibility that they could lose their children. They are terrified and distrustful of mandated reporters, as the very people tasked with helping them turn around and report them to CPS. If parents cannot seek help when they're in crisis from doctors, social workers, therapists, and the other people who could provide them with resources and care, they instead hide. And this makes children less safe, not more. Even when children are not removed, the threat of removal hangs over parents, especially in communities where CPS presence is strong. For this crowd, I don't think I have to explain too much about what an investigation looks like, but I think it is worth reminding people that an investigation is hardly a non-event. You hear a loud knock on the door. It's nighttime. Your children are sleeping. You open the door and they say it is CPS, and you are terrified. No one explains what your rights are. You don't want to let them in, but they say if you don't, they'll call the police to break down the door. You comply. They say they need to search your house. They look in your fridge. They comment on what you've purchased and what you haven't. They note that you have dirty dishes in the sink and unfolded laundry in the hallway. They look in your medicine cabinet. They ask you if you're dating and who. They ask invasive questions about your sex life. They ask you to take a drug test, although no one has alleged that you use drugs. They wake your children and talk to them outside of your presence, even asking them questions about who you're dating. They lift your children's shirts and inspect their bodies, and in some cases, pull their pants down to do the same. Over the next few days, they talk to your neighbors, your relatives, your friends. They show up at your children's school. You feel violated and humiliated. For those of you who have never experienced an investigation, what would a caseworker say if they watched you parent your children? Is your house perfectly clean at all times? Do you sometimes have 3 glasses of wine? Do you ever have a bad day? Do you ever lose your temper? How would you feel if a government agent sat in your home taking notes while you raised your children? Even if kids are not removed, the threat is ever present and traumatic. Children are treated like bargaining chips. If the parent doesn't do what CPS says, they will lose their children. Parents in the family policing system suffer harm through contact with caseworkers who come to their homes or supervise visitation with their children. Parents report caseworkers describing them as bad or sick and talking about them like they're not there. Understandably, parents hate being observed in their daily interactions with their children and feel a loss of dignity as their parenting choices are constantly questioned in front of their children. Court proceedings are also extremely distressing for parents because they experience public shaming, where their parenting is dissected by judges and attorneys for the state in the most degrading manner. Many lawyers talk about parents as if they're not in the room and like they're not human beings. Attorneys and caseworkers can recall the contents of the parents' refrigerators, yet do not call them by their names. Even attorneys who represent parents may harm their clients through acts of silencing or by questioning whether they are honest. Judges say horrible things to and about parents. One parent recalled hearing a judge say, "I don't think she's fit to be a mother. She doesn't deserve her baby back. I'll have to see. He needs to be with his father. I don't care who he is with as long as he is not with her." And if a child is removed, people blame you for the loss and assume things about you as a parent and as a human, which leads to shame, trauma, guilt, blame, and isolation. When parents are depressed, they feel like their children have died. One mother said, "I went insane. I broke down, nearly died. I couldn't stay in my house. I couldn't be around their clothes. I found myself just wandering around looking for them, even though, they're not there. It's traumatizing. It's awful. It's as if the 3 of them died. One day just died. That's the grief that I went through. That's the pain that I went through. But meanwhile, they didn't die. Somebody's got them, and somebody is keeping them from me." Even where parents have experienced the unthinkable, they first lost a child to death and later lost children to the system, they expressed that losing their child to the system was worse because of the uncertainty. One mother said that she knew her child who had died was up in heaven with God where he belongs. But for her other children who had been removed, she said, "I don't know where my children are. I don't know if the system is doing them right or doing them wrong." Many parents who suffer from substance use disorder or alcoholism have those conditions exacerbated by the depression and anxiety that accompanies the loss of their children. Parents may experience ambiguous loss, which occurs when people don't know whether the loss is permanent or not. At its essence, it is a loss without closure. Often it creates a situation of confusion where people can't make sense of what's going on and they don't know if their loved one will return. This experience is characterized as the most devastating form of loss because of the indeterminacy. One mother said they were grieving a child that someone else was parenting. Parents who have lost their children to CPS may also experience disenfranchised grief, in which they endure a loss that is not openly acknowledged or supported within a wider society. Grief can be disenfranchised for a number of reasons based on how society views the grieving person, their relationship to the loved one lost, and the circumstances of that loss. These mourners are often unable to openly grieve in a way that society deems legitimate because they are seen as somehow to blame for the loss. This type of loss is often seen in families of death row inmates, the families of individuals killed by the police, or partners who have lost their loved ones to HIV. Parents who lose their children to the family policing system are no different. Many parents experience severe depression and panic attacks when they were reminded of their children. One mother expressed how she became homeless because every time she went into her house and found it empty, she had a panic attack. So she just never went back. For those of you who are parents, you know how much of your identity is tied to that label. Many mothers who had their children removed felt a loss of that identity because so much of their lives had been tied to motherhood. One mother expressed how she didn't know how to answer the question of whether she was a parent because she had children, but they weren't with her. This loss can also lead to deep shame because there is a perceived failure in a role that society holds in high esteem. One mother said that it feels like you're not capable of anything. I lost hope in myself, faith in myself, like, I don't know, I didn't care about life. When dealing with all of these feelings, mothers who lose their children may also feel very alienated and isolated from their support networks and mistrustful of professionals such as social workers and therapists, as described before. Some who sought help felt that their trauma and resulting mental health struggles weren't recognized by those from whom they sought assistance. This exacerbated existing trauma and issues such as anxiety and depression, which for some led to PTSD. The combination of these experiences can lead to social isolation and feelings of total aloneness. This can ultimately negatively affect their ability to maintain meaningful contact with their children and hinder their ability to reunite, which is harmful for both them and their children. Losing a child to the system can even increase the risk of death. One study demonstrated that mothers whose children were in the foster system were 3.5 times more likely to die from avoidable causes, such as an intentional injury and suicide, and 2.9 times more likely to die from unavoidable causes like heart disease. For many, the thought of reuniting is what keeps them going. So once that is taken away through a termination of parental rights or TPR, the loss of control, sometimes even just the list of steps they can take to potentially gain custody of their children once more, can lead to a sense of hopelessness. When a parent loses their legal relationship to their children, they are literally erased from their children's lives like they have never existed. In most states, TPR is a permanent severance of the parent-child relationship, and parents cannot have any contact with their children during their minority. And because of the blame and isolation that follows, most parents are left without support or resources to help them process that grief. If children are adopted, the pain is compounded. As Suzanne Sellers, the executive director of the nonprofit Families Organizing for Child Welfare Justice, and a mother whose rights to her two children were terminated, put it, once adopted, the law says that all of the rights and care transfers to the adopted parents, and the mothers, the birth mothers, are expected to just disappear, just go away. And that's very difficult to do emotionally, spiritually, and physically. We still do exist. Fathers, of course, have similar experiences to mothers, but even less research is focused on them. Fathers, like mothers, grieve the loss of their children and feel like they have failed. This is made worse by loved ones telling them that they have in fact failed and express judgment of who they are as people. And I want to take a second to acknowledge that while many of the parents who lose their children did not cause harm at all, or if harm occurred, it was not intentional, there are, of course, some parents who do hurt their children. And in an awful minority of cases, parents who kill their children. But even the parents who hurt their children suffer harm. They too mourn the loss of their children and express regrets at the harm that they have caused. Many of the parents who caused harm have suffered extreme, untreated trauma in their own lives. They do not want to harm their children, but have also never been given the tools to parent a different way. And it should go without saying, but it is worth repeating, that certain parents experience all of the harms that I've detailed here more frequently than others. Parents of color face and feel both implicit bias and overt racism. Many allegations against them include coded language, calling them aggressive and hostile and erratic, based on stereotypes primarily about Black women. Racism itself can cause depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem, among other effects, that can then impact their ability to parent effectively or meet the requirements placed on them by the system. Many parents are also suffering the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma because of our country's legacy of removing children. First, during the period of enslavement, taking children and selling them for profit, but also as a way to enforce dominance over their parents, and later taking Native American children to so-called boarding schools and adopting them out to white families to strip them of their language and their culture. And Native American families and descendants of enslaved people feel the effects of our shameful history through continued oppression of their communities, which are situated in the greater context of their experiences. As one mother, Sawara Robinson, put her pain into poetry, being called everything except my name, walking, smiling, yet in pain, but you don't acknowledge, you change the game, changing rules like a child made to behave, gaining monetary, my child on the slave trade, running in circles forced to obey. The future, my life, will never be the same. On top of the intergenerational trauma for certain communities, CPS involvement itself is intergenerational. Foster youth are more likely to themselves become parents who then lose their own children to the system. Court cases and child removal can also cause structural vulnerability, particularly for parents who are impoverished. These interventions can cause parents to lose benefits or housing due to the change in their family composition, creating further chaos in their lives. In addition, parents are required to comply with services ranging from parenting classes to drug testing to maintaining stable housing and employment, as if that's an easy thing to do. If they miss their programs due to work, they are told to prioritize their children. But if they do not have work or housing, they cannot reunify with their children. A mother whose unstable housing caused the state to remove her children and pay foster parents to raise them rather than paying for her housing explained, who can really function or focus in a situation where everything around you is on fire? At the end of the day, we are asking parents to be their best when they're in the worst situations of their lives. And all of these harms have ripple effects in our communities. Anonymous reporting to CPS creates mistrust of neighbors. Many report that neighbors and friends reported them to CPS as a form of retaliation or spite. As Dorothy Roberts and others have written, the constant removal of children from certain communities and the resulting effects on parents and extended families also reduces community power. And communities feel this loss. As one young person put it after describing the family separation in her own family and others around her, we can never come together to do anything over here. We can never, it definitely has an effect on the community because bringing separation like that, I don't know what it does, but we can't as a people and as a community come together. So hopefully I've convinced you that family policing involvement is harmful to parents. So why don't we care? Why do we continue to operate a system that devastates parents in these ways? I think there is a pervasive attitude that some parents just don't deserve their children. They don't deserve them because they are bad or because they're different. Secondly, we believe that parents are expendable if we save their children. We don't interrogate where this instinct comes from or what it really means to keep children safe. And in part, this is because system actors like caseworkers and judges have to make sure that at the end of the day, they aren't in trouble for making a mistake, a truly legitimate fear, but often one that leads to the wrong result for children and parents. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the parents in the system and then about the system actors. So who are these parents that don't deserve their children? I started by talking about these so-called monster parents, parents in the headlines for causing harm to their children. People call them evil, the devil. For a lot of people, these headlines inform their entire view of the family policing system. Based on media coverage and the narrative that surrounds parents in the system, you'd think this was the majority, when in reality, as I explained, it's a very small minority. So for many people, why would we care about parents when we think that these are who the parents in the system are? Research also shows that the majority of parents who get entrapped by the family policing system are of lesser means. And I don't think I have to tell you that we have a history of hating poor people in this country. We blame them for structural and systemic barriers to economic prosperity, and then say that it is their fault. A founding document from the Children's Bureau, the federal agency that administers the family policing system, states, children are not safe and happy if their parents are miserable, and parents must be miserable if they cannot protect their home against poverty. So basically, if parents can't prevent themselves from being poor, then they must be miserable. And not only will their kids be miserable, but they also won't be safe. Many believe that to be poor and then bring a child into the world is a selfish, irresponsible act. And compounding this is the idea that poor people are a monolithic group of substandard parents. And as I mentioned, Black and Native families continue to be overpoliced by all systems, including the family policing system, in part because of negative and pervasive stereotypes that persist. Black parents have always faced an uphill battle. As Professor Patricia Hill Collins has written, portraying African American women as stereotypical mammies, matriarchs, welfare recipients, and hot mamas helps justify US Black women's oppression. And Black fathers face their own stereotypes as criminals and deadbeats, even though research shows that they're actually more involved in the day-to-day care of their children than their white counterparts. The largest group of parents who are targeted by family policing are single mothers. Single mothers are another group that our society has focused on as the cause of evils in our society. I'll spare you the history lesson, but policy after policy has centered around excluding single mothers, and really only single Black mothers from state assistance. Epitomized by Ronald Reagan's welfare queens, society has been led to believe that the typical welfare recipient is a Black woman who has children in order to live a life of leisure on a taxpayer's dime, despite the fact that the largest recipients of public benefits in America are actually white. And of course, it should not matter which mothers need the assistance of the government to raise their children. The government should be thrilled to give money to mothers doing the hard work of raising its future citizens. This is the reality in many other countries around the world. There is also a perception that parents in the system overwhelmingly use substances. Again, we repeat the mistakes of our past, such as the panic over crack babies in the late 80s and early 90s, where the discourse turned to how mothers were selfish and put drugs above their children. The rhetoric was highly racialized, and the face of the so-called selfish drug-using mother was usually Black. And this was repeated recently when states like Tennessee were considering fetal assault laws, charging mothers criminally if they used substances while pregnant. Legislators called these mothers the worst of the worst. Tennessee ended up sunsetting that law after 1 year because it discouraged women from seeking prenatal care or substance use treatment. And the majority of the women who were charged under this law were Black. Again, this is an example of how punitive laws make children less safe. When we punish substance users, they fail to take care of their own health and the health of their children because they are worried about the legal repercussions. If we treated substance use disorder as the public health issue that it is, we would have better outcomes for both parents and children. Additionally, not all parents who use drugs have substance use disorder. Many parents safely use drugs and parent their children, like many other parents who have a glass of wine or go out and drink much more than one glass with their friends and still ensure that their children are well cared for. These are some of the perceptions that society and people who work in the family policing system have about parents. And on top of the disdain that they feel for parents, many of them are also scared. Caseworkers and judges are terrified of ending up on the front page of the paper because a child who has already had system contact ends up harmed by their parents, or even worse, killed. Therefore, they sometimes make decisions based on those fears rather than what is best for a child or a family. At the end of the day, this is a system that has always been rooted in child saviorism. The precursors to the family policing system, from slavery to boarding schools to so-called orphan trains, were about saving children from their immoral parents. When the Adoption and Safe Families Act was passed, its leading sponsor said that we will not continue the current system of always putting the needs and rights of the biological parents first. It's time we recognize that some families simply cannot and should not be kept together. And we have always treated parents and children as if they are separate, when in fact they are a unit that should be protected. Further, the system exacerbates parent struggles and makes it harder for them to succeed, not only as parents, but in the other facets of their lives, their jobs, their health, their overall well-being. Professor Sarah Lohr argues that involvement in the family policing system and resulting separation from one's children literally creates disability in parents by creating new impairments or exacerbating them in the ways described before. Through these practices, we inflict trauma that is so pronounced that neither they nor their children will ever be able to fully escape it. When parents aren't at their best, it has negative impacts on our whole society. We want our entire community to operate at its fullest potential. Many of the parents involved in the system will have more children. If parents are not healthy, thriving, and supported, we cannot expect their children to be. This is perhaps one explanation for why foster children have a high likelihood of losing their own children to the system when they become parents. Focusing on our contempt for parents causes us to enact laws and policies that are actually harmful to children. It is just common sense that if we want kids to thrive, we have to support their parents. There is so much data that even when parents have made mistakes, their children suffer harm when they are taken from them. Adoptees report that even when they had great adoptive parents, they still grieve the loss of their biological families. Rather than punishing people in these ways and making it impossible for parents to reunite with their children in a system that sets them up to fail, we could create conditions to actually allow people to raise their children free from poverty, control, and surveillance. So how do we do that? I have 3 policy proposals and some suggestions for those of you who work in the system. First, we should immediately implement anti-poverty measures. I mentioned that a significant portion of the cases in the family policing system deal with poverty. Even if you disagree with whether to characterize certain behaviors as poverty or neglect, there is no disputing the fact that the majority of the families in the system are poor. Thus, many problems could be alleviated with concrete material supports. And regardless of where you stand, the data is clear. Cash transfers or universal basic income of as little as $1,000 a month can drastically reduce the likelihood of a referral to CPS. One study suggests that it can even reduce child mortality. And to be clear, there are multiple reasons why this is true, and it is not because poor parents are more abusive or neglectful than their wealthier counterparts. A staggering amount of money is spent on the family policing system. Depending on the factors considered, the numbers vary, but they are all astronomical. One estimate suggested that the national cost of the things that are classified as child maltreatment to our society, including mental health and medical care, as well as the cost of the family policing system and criminal legal system involvement, was $104 billion annually. With that money, we could invest in community-based supports, affordable childcare, high quality healthcare, and cash transfers for parents. Second, we should eliminate the practice of mandated reporting. It is important to note that removing the mandate does not prevent people from reporting. It simply removes the fear that mandated reporters feel if they don't report, they will face negative consequences. Take the example of education personnel. In the United States, education personnel are responsible for the highest number of reports. Their reports are also the least likely to be substantiated. But each report has to be investigated by caseworkers who already face high caseloads, and as a result, they have less time to spend on more serious cases because they are spread too thin. As I mentioned, mandated reporting also scares parents into not asking for help when they really need it. In both of these ways, mandated reporting makes children less safe. The last time I spoke at this conference, I presented with an impacted parent, Shakira Page, who talked about how she was so scared of CPS that when she ran out of food, instead of asking for help, she fed her family peanut butter for days. Imagine if she could have gone to her shelter worker and asked for assistance, finding a food pantry or some other concrete support rather than hiding. We could replace the idea of mandated reporting with mandated supporting, a phrase coined by my friend Joyce McMillan. This is simply the idea that rather than reporting to CPS, we should just try to help people. I know, nuts. As JMF for Families has described it, if a kid is coming to school without a coat, instead of calling CPS, find him a coat. And of course, I understand that it is more complicated in cases of abuse. but there are other solutions there too, and lessons that we can learn from restorative and transformative justice. And finally, we should end the disgusting and illogical practice of termination of parental rights. We terminate parental rights even in cases where children have no chance of being adopted. And research shows that after children age out of foster care, often alone in the world, they tend to look for their families. Rather than continuing to allow their parents to try to be in their lives, these kids become legal orphans. Children do not magically forget that they once had parents. If they are placed with other people and parents can retain visitation and rights to contact their children, in most cases, this will be a positive thing. The more people that love a child, the better. The thing is, though, that none of these policy changes will work without a fundamental shift in our thinking. So the project that we must work on in the long term is to change the narrative that surrounds families in the system. For those of you who work in the system, even within the current confines, you can begin this work. Our system has set caseworkers up with an impossible dual role. They must both support and investigate and collect data on parents for use in court. It is common sense that we should separate these roles so that parents can actually receive support without feeling scrutinized in the way that they do now. But until then, if caseworkers took the approach of focusing on strengths, not deficits, they could maintain better relationships with parents and actually achieve better outcomes for families. Judges should take into account the effects of removal on parents that I've laid out here when deciding whether a parent is compliant and in determining whether reasonable efforts were made and what services are appropriate, if any. Lawyers for parents should work with their clients to ensure that the narrative that is presented in court is what the parent wants. We lawyers often focus on winning and losing, but for many parents, a win is having the court hear their truth. Lawyers for children can help the court to see the parent through the child's eyes, to help them understand cultural or religious practices that are important to a family, to help them see that a parent who might be struggling is doing the best that they can for their child. There is a tool in clinical legal education called parallel universe thinking that I think all system actors could employ. If a parent missed a court appearance, we come to the conclusion that they do not care about their children. But parallel universe thinking directs us to think of all the other possibilities that could lead to the same result. They may not have had enough money for the train. The train may have never shown up. They could have had to make a choice between work and court and were worried about losing their job. They could have been so depressed that they could not get out of bed. They could have faced crippling anxiety at the thought of entering the courtroom. There are endless possibilities, some of them affording the parent more grace than others. And at a higher level, rather than judging parents for being unable to meet their children's needs, we could blame the systems that created these conditions. We could acknowledge the horrific effects of slavery, the decimation of the Native American people and their land, redlining, discriminatory employment practices, and systemic racism for entrenching people in poverty. Instead of spending money on a foster system that fails to care for our children and instead leaves them alone on their 21st birthdays, impoverished, undereducated, and traumatized, we could use that money to support their families to be able to provide them with the things that we all want for our children: a safe place to live, high quality healthcare and education, green spaces, and community centers. We have to stop being content with a system that we know inflicts these harms on both parents and children, because if not, we are complicit. All of these things will help us to have compassion for parents who are struggling in the ways that usually lead to punishment. And this leads me to my most radical proposal: empathy. While the idea of empathy might be a little pie in the sky for many of you, I ask you, what would you want for yourself? What would you want for your sister or your brother, for your children and for theirs? If you were struggling financially or with mental health or substance use disorder, how would you want to be treated? Would you want to be judged for your worst moment or a bad day? Would you want to be punished, dehumanized, separated, and devastated? Would you want them to take your children from you? I encourage you to take your response with you into your work and treat every family like it was yours. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today.
Thank you, Shanta. We have just a few minutes for questions. Let me just say that we've had quite a lot of chat comments in the chatter in the chat, and I'll just accentuate this one who said this was a brilliant presentation.
Thank you. I'm sorry I can't see the comments, but thank you.
So here are a couple questions that came in. Where's the discussion of drug use and mental health? Why is child welfare being blamed when the United States has one of the poorest mental health systems in the world?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Why are we blaming the system, not the larger structural forces at play?
Why are we blaming perhaps the child protection system instead of like the deficiencies of a underfunded mental health system?
Yeah, I mean, I would blame both. I mean, I think they go together, right? We are a very rich country, and we have prioritized systems of punishment like the family policing system. And rather than spending money on high quality mental health and substance use disorder treatment in people's communities, we take people's children and pay foster parents to raise them, which, as the research shows, exacerbates those conditions in parents. Many parents, I'm sure you've all met parents or have been a parent who wanted to seek treatment, but you were pregnant or that your client was pregnant, and you were so scared that if you tried to seek help, they would target you and take your child once born. And then once born, if you are known to the system, they will take your child. It will probably happen at birth. And that leads so many parents to spiral. I don't know about you. If someone took my child at birth, I am fortunate to not struggle with mental health conditions or substance use disorders, but I'm pretty sure it would create one. The thought of someone taking my child at birth right now sends me into a spiral, just imagining it.
Me too.
Yeah.
That's the humanity of that you're trying to engender here in our thinking. Another question, a little bit of a comment, but perhaps we can turn it more also into a question. Just this notion of people, domestic violence victims often get children removed. This is another issue. It further harms survivors. Why are we punishing them?
That's a great question. I think most people do not understand the complexities of intimate partner violence. And we don't have the supports for survivors that we should have in place. So it's very easy to tell someone, if you love your child, you would leave your partner. But where is that person supposed to go? Many communities will shame them for leaving their partners. Many of them literally have nowhere to go. They may not have control over their finances. They might not have a place to work. Many people who inflict harm on their partners have also created economic abuse, have ruined their credit, have never had them on a lease or something else to build up their credit. So it's not as simple as saying you should get a protective order, you should leave. I have done some work in this area. I've done some writing in this area if you're interested. And the research shows that, of course, no one wants a child to be in a home where there is violence. That is not ideal for a child. But what is very clear from the research is that the very worst approach is to remove that child from their protective parent, because the thing that mitigates the harmful effects of witnessing violence is the protective relationship between the child and the other parent. And the research is out there, and yet we continue to punish parents who don't have the means to leave their partner, or may not want to leave for other reasons.
Thank you for that response. Here's another question, and I'll just say that we do have another panel in a few hours on the termination of parental rights. But do you disagree with TPR for all cases? What about cases when a child is removed at birth and a parent fails to engage in a treatment plan to mitigate said concerns for years? Does that child not deserve timely permanency?
I think the idea of permanency is complicated. And if I'm not saying that a child should not be adopted if there is a person who is able and the other parent and the biological parent is not engaging and doesn't want to be involved. But I do think that that child will grow up to have questions about where they came from. And I understand that it may not be possible in all situations, and the parent may not want to be involved. And I think that's a different scenario. But in so many cases, parents are fighting for years to remain involved in their children's life. And maybe one proposal that Professor Chris Gottlieb, who is at NYU, has made is that the adoption should continue, but parents, the biological parents, should retain rights of like contact and visitation. So the child can continue to have the permanency of being adopted, but still be able to access their biological parent and their community and their extended family. As I said before, the more people that love a child, the better.
Well, and with that last comment, I think we'll conclude. But let me just say, we have had a few comments come in as well. I'd like to read them to you just as an affirmation of from the community that's been listening to you. I'm a former foster youth and have not really thought about how parents would feel throughout the whole process. So thank you for shedding light on that. And another person who said, love this, mirrors what we're attempting to do in one of our counties. The most resistance is from mandated reporters who are afraid of getting in trouble, and some of our staff who are rooted in the old way of doing things. And I hope these beliefs and ideas that you spread or that you've talked about spread and go far and wide. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Again, thank you so much for this thoughtful, thought-provoking presentation, and we look forward to additional sessions that will kind of continue some of what you've put into our conference universe over the next number of days. So again, we appreciate your scholarship. We appreciate your research and the work that you are continuing to do on behalf of parents, children, and families. So thank you.